This is session 5, page 11, and I wanted to reiterate that this is we're doing Christian history, not Christian doctrine, in that I'm going to tell you what these people believed. That's not necessarily in every case exactly what I believe, but anyway. We left off last time talking about the establishment of the First Baptist Congregation in America in Rhode Island in 1638. And we've talked about this before, the distinctives of Baptists, whether it's Anabaptists or Mennonites or anything like that. It was couple of things: religious liberty. And kind of going along with that is no established church. The government shouldn't have any say in what goes on in the church. And of course, then believers' baptism. And so Roger Williams, then, he denounced the theocracy in Massachusetts, and that got him banished. And so he goes over, and with a guy named John Clark, they start the the history of American Baptists, and so forth. Also, the colonies played a huge role in allowing a lot of different religious flavors, if you will. Whereas at one time the persecution came from the Roman Catholic Church upon Protestants. Now it had flipped in England, and now it was the Roman Catholics who were suffering persecution. And if you remember, last time we talked about how the gunpowder plot, in which the idea was that they were going to decapitate the English government by blowing up Parliament House. Well, that didn't help the Roman Catholic popularity much in England. And so shortly after that, a guy by the name of George Calvert, who was the Lord of Baltimore, got a permission from the King of England to come over and establish a colony which was a haven for Roman Catholics. And so he realized that they might be in the minority someday. He owned Maryland kind of like he was as a business, But they had a legislative body, and he got them to enact a law, Act of Toleration, in 1649. And the only things that you had to do to live in Maryland in peace was you had to accept the Trinity, which would be most Christians at that time, and keep the Sabbath. In other words, you couldn't go out and do certain things on Sunday. Okay, then on page 11 we're looking at continental European Christianity. Another thing that kind of contributes to a lot of the stuff that's going on is the threat of the Turkish Muslims began to recede in the 1500s and the 1600s. They were defeated in an attempt to invade Europe in 1529 at the Battle of Vienna. They got all the way to Austria and were thrown back. And then they suffered some other defeats in the 1600s. So now Europe is going to be able to think about its, religion without the fear of the Islamic invasions, because by that time it was pretty apparent that the energy of the Muslims had receded, and they weren't going to be a big threat anymore. In France, we look here at the War of the Three Henrys, and I kind of touched on this, and if you remember, there were three different guys named Henry that were fighting for control of France, and the Protestant Henry won. But shortly after he became King Henry IV, he decided to switch to Roman Catholic. He thought that would unite the country more, but it wasn't enough for one particular Catholic priest who didn't like his Edict of Nantes, which granted religious toleration for Protestants, and he was assassinated. And eventually, France gets to the point where Louis XIV, y'all may have heard of Louis XIV, you know, he built the great palace at Versailles, and cost probably $1 billion in that day's money, not in today's money. And so Louis XIV, he made the famous statement, "I am the state," and he didn't want anybody with any different viewpoint than his. And he drove he told, where in an earlier day they may have executed Protestants, he just wanted them out of the country. And so the French Calvinists, called Huguenots, about 400,000 were driven out of the country. And that probably contributed greatly to France. You know, the French Revolution comes along in the next century and everything, and so the attacks upon the Roman Catholic Church, there wasn't any other church to attack in France, and so and so forth. Okay, let's look at Lutheranism. Now, it was mainly in the German states, in the northern German states, and in Scandinavia. We're talking about Norway and Denmark and so forth. And Philip Melanchthon, if y'all remember, we talked about him. He was Luther's buddy. And even though we call it the Lutheran Church, the doctrines of the Lutheran Church were more in line with this guy, Philip Melanchthon. And so whereas Luther was hardcore on like predestination and and all that kind of stuff, Melanchthon was not. And so that's why a lot of people, that confuses a lot of people when they find out Luther was just like Calvin, on that sort of thing. And then the Lutheran Church is not. It's because Philip Melanchthon was really the person that was most responsible for the founding of the Lutheran Church. Now, out of Lutheranism, there was a group called the Lutheran Pietists. And this was a movement to restore a little bit of the emotion back into the Christian faith. Whereas now the Reformers, John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli and Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon and all these guys were real good at trying to establish correct doctrine. They weren't much on evangelism in the sense we think of it today. Okay? And so this Lutheran within the Lutheran movement, there was this other movement called Pietism, and this inspired a guy by the name of Count Nikolaus Ludwig von Zinzendorf, who was over in Moravia, which was part of the Holy Roman Empire, the German states at that time. And this guy was extremely wealthy. And when he started the Moravian movement, and at first it was kind of like a movement within the Lutheran Church, but then it became a separate thing. And he basically died basically penniless, because I'm going to say that again, Nikolaus Ludwig von Zinzendorf, what he did is he gave up practically his entire fortune to advance this cause. And so the Moravians, they're very strict, they're very dedicated, and today, let's say if look at it around the room, most of these people are members of this church, right? We pretty well we took you, right? Okay. Not so fast in the Moravians. They had to investigate you. And it may take 5 years before they decided you were up to snuff to join the Moravian churches, So they were they were pretty tough.
But they could attend, right?
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, they could attend, but you couldn't become a member until you'd kind of proven yourself that you were really dedicated.
Couldn't be a voting member.
Yeah.
Aren't the Mormons that way also?
You got me there. I don't know.
I think you have to be approved, and you have to be making so much money.
Oh, really?
Yeah. and then if you're not gonna.
Before you can vote in the,
Yeah,
in,
right,
or
yeah.
whatever?
If
Okay.
if you don't give a good portion of your money to the church, then you're not, you don't get in. They have levels.
Yeah. Okay, and so I wanted to kind of set the Moravians aside there for just a second. Let's don't forget them, because they're going to be important in the rest of our story here in just a little bit. Now let's go back to British Christianity. And last time when we talked about the English Civil War, if you remember, Oliver Cromwell overthrew the King of England, Charles I, and Cromwell ruled the country for for 5 years as Lord Protector. I think that was his title. And then his son takes over, and he doesn't have the force of personality that Oliver Cromwell had, and he didn't last very long before they got rid of him and they restored the Stuart monarchs. But here's the important thing. It is said that even though the king, the monarchy was restored in England, it would never be the same again. And it never was the same again after Cromwell. He broke the power of the monarchy in England. But even though a lot, that's kind of, and if you go to most history classes, they're going to tell you that. However, what they're not going to tell you is that there were other effects of Oliver Cromwell, and one was he broke the power of the established church. It's sort of like, yeah, they still have a monarchy over there in England, but they don't. I mean, they have a new prime minister is appointed. Yeah, it's all show. You go in and you have tea with the Queen, and she says, I say, would you like to be my prime minister? And they go, yes, and they go through this show. Okay, so the monarchy was never the same again after Cromwell. But the other thing that's not talked about as much is the established church never again had the power that it had after Cromwell. Cromwell did not want an established church. He wanted... he was what was called an independent or a separatist, okay? And he didn't believe there should be an established church. Now, I don't want to give you the idea that Oliver Cromwell was a believer in big liberty or anything. He was for religious liberty for just about everybody but Catholics. He even had religious liberty for Jews. But one of the things that he did is he closed the ale houses, and that made a lot of Englishmen mad. They can't go to their ale house, and he closed the stage, and the stage was kind of like Hollywood. When people think of Hollywood, they don't think of great moral values, generally. I always think it's funny when all these Hollywood actors get up and start talking about gun control and all that.
It had any value.
If you took away guns out of Hollywood movies, there wouldn't be much in the movie, But anyway, I'm kind of digressing there a little bit. But it was considered kind of like a place for sinful activity. And so Cromwell closes the stage, he closes the alehouses, and that caused him, a lot of people resented it, but there wasn't a whole lot they could do about it. And then until Cromwell dies, his son takes over, they're ready to bring back the Stuarts, the monarchy. Now the monarchs do come back, but as I say, they're never going to be the same again. They're still going to have some power, at that time, but not like it was before. And so anyway, what he did now is the Church of England was reestablished under page 12 after Cromwell's death under King Charles II and his brother James II. And one of the reasons that they were able to get back on the throne is they promised toleration. Just put us, Charles says, put me back on the throne and I'll tolerate everybody. And Baptists were among those in England that were big supporters of bringing back Charles I. And then after he gets in, he starts persecuting people. He lied. It's hard to believe that he would do that. But he like all the other kings, they didn't want people with different religious views because they didn't want a power outside of them. When I say the monarchy was never the same again, it's not that he didn't want it to be. He was just never able to get it done. And
is Charles after James?
Charles the...
Or is Charles
okay, there's James the First,
right?
Charles the First,
Okay.
Charles the Second, James the Second. And so persecution began quickly against dissenters. He wants to make everybody be part of the Church of England. They passed the Test Act, which excluded Catholics from any civil or military position, high-ranking civil or military positions in the country. And if you remember in our Constitution, there's something in there called the No Religious Test Clause, that there's no religious test on holding position in the government of the United States. You know, that they can't say you're off limits because you're this or you're that. Okay, so who are the dissenters? You've got the established church. The dissenters are the Presbyterians, who were in the saddle for a while during the English Civil War. The Congregationalists, that's basically the separatists. Baptists, Quakers, and Roman Catholics. This was the time period in which John Bunyan was jailed. He was a Baptist preacher. He was preaching without a license. He spent 12 years in prison for preaching without a license, during which time he wrote the famous book, Pilgrim's Progress. Okay, well, Charles II dies without an heir, so the throne passes to his brother, the Grand Duke, and he's going to become James II. Now, this creates a problem because if you remember, their daddy was Charles I, the guy that got his head chopped off, and had the Catholic queen. And so when Charles was arrested, his wife and their two sons escaped to Europe. Okay, she was a Catholic. She raised her two boys as Catholics. So Charles II, he kind of, what's the word I'm put on it? He kind of acted the part of a Protestant. But James was open about it. He's Catholic. He married a Catholic. He is Catholic. But, so they don't want him to be the King of England. Parliament doesn't. But they decided they didn't want to go through another English Civil War. And so they decided, okay, we'll let you be king. Because James II was at an age where he's not going to live all that much longer, and his wife was past childbearing age. And they had two grown daughters who had married Protestants and had gone over to the Protestant side. So they said, okay, we'll let you be king, because they knew that the next ruler would be a Protestant. Okay? Then about 5 years into his reign, his wife gave birth to a son. And that's going to cause him to be over the girls in the line of succession. And they said, hey, we're not putting up with this. And so Parliament fires the King of England. And there was a book written by a guy named John Locke who justified the Glorious Revolution, as they called it, when they fired the king. Because that was a big deal to fire the king. You know, what right do you have to fire the King of England? You know, there were a lot of people who felt like God had put him on the throne, so you shouldn't remove him unless God removes him. And so John Locke justified it. Well, so you got a new act of toleration, and many dissenters were now free from persecution, and that included the English Baptists. Now let's go back to the English Baptists for a little while. They had been strong supporters of Cromwell. They filled the lower ranks, not the officer ranks, but the lower ranks of Cromwell's army during the English Civil War. But a funny thing happened to English Baptists after they had been growing under persecution. But now the persecution ends, and within a few years, Baptists are in steep decline. Weird deal. You know, they grew under persecution, but it's sort of like the early Christians, you know, grew under persecution. But you remember there were two different kinds of Baptists. Do y'all remember that? There were the general Baptists who believed in the general atonement that Jesus died for everyone, and the particular Baptists who were Calvinistic. And the general Baptists were damaged by drifting into a new movement called Unitarianism. And that was the belief that, you know, Jesus, he was pretty important, but he wasn't God. Okay? And some of these general Baptists drifted off into that. And when that happened, I mean, they just...
Well, they didn't believe in the virgin birth.
Yeah, they went by the wayside. And the particular Baptists, they were damaged by what we would call hyper-Calvinism. Now, generally speaking, when people say hyper-Calvinism, what they're talking about is it's a Calvinist, you know, they buy into this predestination thing so strongly, they say, what's the point? What's the point of telling, you know, it's already determined anyway. And so they still have church and they teach you how to lead a good life and be a good Christian and all that sort of thing, but they don't really have an evangelistic outreach.
Well, do they know if they're saved or not? Do they think they're the ones that come to church and, you know, follow teachings?
Well, they look at things like the way your life is. They figure that's a sign of the elect. If you're prosperous, if you full of good works and all that kind of stuff. So, but they don't. A lot of those groups that get, you know, the hyper Calvinist groups don't grow very much. You know, they tend to have they have a little super Christian group, and that's about it. Okay, and then another group that had been around for a few years were the Quakers. Now, the Quakers were led by a guy by the name of George Fox, and you may have heard, if you haven't heard of George Fox, you've probably heard of a book that he wrote, Fox's Book of Martyrs, in which he talks about, you know, the early Christians being persecuted, and then the persecutions under like Bloody Mary and all that sort of thing. Very anti-Catholic. And but in 1661, at the time of the restoration of the Stuart monarchy, there were 4,200 Quakers, not in England, but in prison in England. And so what was it that these people believed that got them in trouble? Well, Fox opposed organized Christianity, said it was all pretty well corrupt, and he emphasized what he called the inner light. And now, kind of what would the inner light be? It would be kind of like we would think of, you know, the Holy Spirit's directing you to do certain things and so forth. And so you'd go to a Quaker service, there wouldn't be a minister. You just go and you're sitting there, and, you know, if Bob decides to, you know, he'll stand up and start talking. And everybody, if you want to listen to what he has to say, if you decide, hey, you know, the World Series starts in a few minutes and I'm leaving, you know, and if you want to sing a song, go ahead. But other people may not care for what the song you're singing.
Mormons are like that too in their services.
Are they?
Yeah.
So, well, anyway, but they rejected formal worship, singing, baptism, the Lord's Supper. They thought all that was extraneous. They tended towards pacifism and philanthropy. Now, one thing I'm going to say is they were the earliest leaders in England in the abolitionist movement, abolition of slavery, and so forth. William Penn. Now, William Penn, he's the guy on the Quaker Oats box. Okay, that's William Penn. Okay, and his father had loaned money to Charles II to get to in the restoration, okay, of the Stuart monarchy. And so he owed his father some money. His father dies. So now he owes it to his father, to the estate. And William Penn inherits this deal. And so the king and William Penn talked about how to settle this debt. And Penn had converted to the Quaker movement. And he said, well, you know, we'd like to go someplace where they're not persecuting us. And so, you know, that's kind of what America became. It was kind of like anybody they didn't want in England, they pushed him off to America. And so he was given a charter, and he started 2 colonies, Pennsylvania and Delaware. And they also had a Toleration Act. And if you remember the Toleration Act in Maryland, it was that you had to believe in the Trinity. Well, the Toleration Act in Pennsylvania was probably, other than Rhode Island, where Roger Williams was about the most free religious liberty thing was. All you had to believe was in one God. You had to be monotheistic, so it kept out the Unitarians. No, it didn't keep out the Unitarians, but it wouldn't keep out Unitarians. It wouldn't keep out Jews. It wouldn't even keep out Muslims. Now, there weren't any Muslims moving to America, but there were a lot of Jews that came over from Europe, because you may have heard this. It was in all the papers that Jews sometimes got persecuted in Europe. Okay, so they find out about this, and they come to America, to Philadelphia, and it, you know, the city of brotherly love, and so you had all that.
Didn't they also believe that they were the only ones going to heaven?
I don't know that Quakers believe that. I don't know.
Did the Quakers, the ones in prison, and let them come out and come to America?
Well, there may have been some Quakers in prison they let out and come to America, I'm sure. I wouldn't doubt that. But there were a lot of people who were let out of prisons to come to America, you know. Okay, now one of the things that began to happen as we get into the 1700s was this movement in Europe called the Enlightenment. And it's hard to make generalizations about the Enlightenment, but some parts of the Enlightenment were I would say, anti-Christian. Okay? And they were very much into rationalist thought. If you know about empirical proof, it'd have to be able to see it, to hear it, smell it, before you can believe it. And one of the beliefs that came out of the Enlightenment was something called deism. Now, under deism, they believe it was an important part of deism to believe that there is a God. Okay, a supreme power. They believed all this stuff didn't just happen. There had to be a creator. But that was his role. He created the world. He was the final judge. They were kind of vague on exactly how he judged you. They definitely did not believe in miracles. They did not believe that God intervened in human history. So this was a direct contradiction of Calvinism, for sure, in particular, and Christianity in general. That because it's kind of hard to read the Bible without seeing miracles and seeing intervention. Okay, and now these deists tended to believe all religions were pretty much equal value. Okay, and somebody said, "Well, I'm a Baptist." Well, that's great, and And they go, I'm this, that's great too, They thought as long as, there's several paths, You've heard this kind of stuff before. Well, there was no deist church, really, but it was a philosophy that influenced the higher ranking clergy in the Church of England. A lot of these guys would get this at the colleges, a lot of them had become very deistic in England. And so the Church of England clergy in particular, but it also affected some of the other churches too. And what you tended to have is these preachers, priests of the Church of England, they'd get up and they'd preach, and there was one preacher, I can't remember his name, but like, he was over in America, but he was kind of the same type of thing. He wasn't actually a deist, but he preached a sermon on water. Well, that's kind of interesting. You talk about water, or what, and all that kind of stuff. But that's the type of stuff they would preach about, And I guess it's all kind of interesting, You can go there and get some information and all that kind of stuff. But what was beginning to happen in England, there was a decline in church attendance, a decline in the moral standards of the country, belief in biblical Christianity. Drunkenness was worse than at any time in English history. And it didn't look too good. So into this steps two brothers, John and Charles Wesley, come along, and this is called the Wesleyan Revival. And along with George Whitefield, they start something that has affected us down to the present day. And here's kind of what they had in common, before we go into specifics about them, is that the way it was in England for most people is, you're born in England, you're a Christian. It's sort of like today. A lot of people think if you're born in America, you're a Christian, unless it's kind of the default position, And you have to understand that a lot of people in other parts of the world, they think everybody in America is a, quote, Christian. And when they see Hollywood movies, they think that's a representation of Christianity, that's... And so you can see why a lot of Muslims have a very low opinion of the morals of Christians when they... Okay. All right. Now, but the thing that... This is the Great Awakening in England, the Great Awakening in America. The thing that the Wesleys and Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards all kind of had in common was this concept of the new birth. Now, they didn't create the concept of the new birth. That's a biblical doctrine. You remember what Jesus told Nicodemus? Except a man be born again, he cannot be saved, right? That has to happen. And so that was kind of the sermon that all these people preached. That was I'd say, if you want to put one generalization on it, it was, you've got to be born again. There's a new birth. It's not good enough to be a member of the church. It's not good enough that you were baptized as an infant. You've got to be, and all of them were, infant baptizers. All these people that led this movement. Okay. So I'm going to mention George Whitefield in this regard, but then I'm going to talk more about him in America. But John and Charles Wesley. John Wesley was the 15th of 19 children. Now, today you think 19 children, there must have been a lot of kids in the house, but actually I think only 9 lived to adulthood. And John and Charles were 2 of them. Well, John was the son of a minister, and he was ordained as an Anglican priest. And his brother goes to Oxford, there in England, and he starts a group. And it didn't have an actual name at first. There were just some guys that got together to talk about Christianity, kind of a Bible, small group, Bible group or whatever. But I know this is going to come to a shock to you that sometimes college students can be rather cruel. And so they came up with, they called them all kinds of names. And the one that stuck was the Holy Club. Now, when I first heard that John and Charles Wesley and George Whitefield were in the Holy Club, I thought, what an arrogant bunch of people, you know. But they didn't, that's not what they, no, they didn't call themselves that. That's just what they were. And they finally just kind of accepted the name, that it was, for shorthand, that was the Holy Club. They were considered fanatics and so forth. Well, John and Charles Wesley, he later gets part of this, and George Whitefield, and they're the leaders. Well, John Wesley is going to America. He wants to be a kind of a missionary, you know, and he was involved with a guy by the name of James Oglethorpe there in England. And James Oglethorpe was concerned because in England, you know, a lot of people, they couldn't pay their bills. They put you in jail till you paid your bills. Now, I've always wondered how you pay your bills if you're in jail, okay?
We do the same thing.
Yeah, we don't call it official, but, you know, it's debt slavery. And so Oglethorpe convinced the king to start a colony where you could put a lot of these, free up the prisons, instead of all these people in debt slavery, you know, free them up for the hardcore cases and let those people go to America. And so they started Georgia, named after King George II. So Wesley believed that these people needed a pastor. And so he goes across the ocean. And while he's going across the ocean, there's a storm. And it's a real bad storm. And John Wesley's throwing up his guts, okay? And he's scared to death. And it's like the ship was about to turn over and all this kind of stuff. And there was this group of Christians in there called the Moravians. Remember I told you I'd bring them back into the picture. And they were just there calmly, you know, they were singing hymns and talking about, oh, Jesus, maybe this is the day I'll get to see you. And John's over there thinking, I'm about to die, people, you know. And they're as calm as they can be. And so he had a lot of conversations with them, and he kind of began to talk. Well, he was basically a failure in America, in Georgia. He got in, just a short little thing, he felt like, at one point he thought that he shouldn't ever get married, that he should just marry the church, you know, and all that kind of stuff. And then he found this woman that he decided he'd change his mind. And then he changed his mind again, and she wasn't real happy about this because they were going to get married. And then so she up quickly on the rebound marries another guy. Well, they're members of his church, and he's their pastor. Long story short, this didn't work out too well, and he decided one day that they weren't living right, and he wasn't going to give them communion. And this didn't go over real well. So Wesley, he heads back to England. And when he gets back to England, he hears the Moravians, remember the Moravians, they're having this meeting at a place on Aldersgate Street in London. So he decides to go to the meeting. And this is on May 24th, 1738. And one of the people is up reading Martin Luther. Remember, they were a movement that came out of the Lutheran movement? Okay. So this guy is reading Martin Luther's preface to his commentary on Romans. Now, I've got that book, Luther's Commentary on Romans, and I've read the preface. It didn't do a thing for me, you know. But Martin Luther sitting there, John Wesley sitting there listening to this, and this is what he says: in the evening, I went very unwillingly to a society in Aldersgate Street. He had a bad attitude. He talked about it. He wasn't in the mood to go, but he decided, he'd go. Where one was reading Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans about 9:15 while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ. I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ alone for salvation. And an assurance was given me that He had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. Now, it's usually portrayed that's when John Wesley got saved. But he said later on that's not what he was saying. He believed he was already a Christian, but this kind of goes in with John Wesley's, in the early Methodist movement, they talked a lot about something called a second work of grace. You get saved, and a lot of the Pentecostal talk about that too, that second work of grace. That this is when he really understood, this faith. Faith is what saves you. It's not works and that type of thing. And this changed John Wesley. Now he starts preaching on the new birth. Okay? Whereas before his sermons were rather dry and all that kind of stuff. And as the Methodist movement grew, now at this point, this is not a separate church. It's a movement within the Church of England. John Wesley and Charles Wesley had no intention of starting a separate denomination. But many of the Church of England Anglican clergy began to attack Methodists from the pulpit, that these people are somebody to avoid. In print, mobs sometimes attacked Methodists in the street. They get so worked up, that these are pretty horrible people. And so as they had a difficulty, if they found out that you were part of the Methodist movement, they're not going to license you to preach in the Church of England. And so what Wesley did is he began to have men who were lay preachers, people who had not been ordained or licensed. He used them and so forth. He also established something called the itinerancy, where preachers would move around frequently. He figured, well, they're going to get tired of that guy after a while, and move a new guy in there and so forth. So another thing that's real important about John Wesley is he really emphasized the importance of sanctification. Now here again, this is not a new Christian doctrine, There's justification. That's when you're saved. Sanctification is you're set aside for God's purpose, and that's where you're supposed to grow as a Christian, and so forth. And so he emphasized that, he believed I think Wesley has been misunderstood. A lot of people think he was preaching perfection, because he did use the word perfection, but he didn't mean that you're without sin. He just meant you'd have victory over sin. You could get to, you could do a whole lot better than what people are doing, is basically what he was saying. And another part of Wesley was the slave trade. Not the slave trade, but attacking the slave trade. The Methodists, from the very beginning of their movement, were really interested in what's going on in the world. Okay, not just getting people saved, but that should also produce a better world. Okay, and so he began to attack things like, and slavery itself he wrote a book called Thoughts Upon Slavery, in which he said, liberty is the right of every human creature as soon as he breathes the vital air, and no human law can deprive him of that right which he derives from the law of nature. And so Wesley got to be good friends with a guy named John Newton. Does anybody know what John Newton is most famous for?
Amazing Grace.
Amazing Grace. He was a slave trader. And John Newton became a Christian, and that was, he wrote the song. He was a Christian, he was a minister, okay? And they were buddies, and they were both opposed to the slave trade and ultimately slavery itself. And then John Newton greatly influenced a guy named William Wilberforce, who was a member of Parliament. Wilberforce preached against slavery and so forth until his death in 1833. And right at the end of his life, they abolished slavery in the British colonies through his efforts. Wesley, because there was kind of a shortage of ministers, Wesley kind of set the example by traveling anywhere he could get an audience. He said, the world is my parish. I'll preach anywhere, that I'll get an audience. And how did he get there? Usually on horseback. And he wrote, it's estimated he traveled 250,000 miles on horseback in his life, delivering 40,000 sermons. He spoke against alcohol. And now when Wesley died, shortly after that, you got the Methodist Church does come into being. You've got the Methodist Church of Great Britain, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Wesleyan Church, the Free Methodist, the Church of the Nazarene, the Salvation Army, the Church of God, all came out of Wesley's movement. And the Pentecostals and the Charismatics are an outgrowth of Wesley's movement as well. Well, let's get started here on American Christianity. And now, Charles Wesley, he's kind of like the third man out here on this stuff a lot of times. But Charles Wesley wrote a lot of great hymns. He was a preacher too, but he was overshadowed by his big brother and George Whitefield, and all that kind of stuff. But when I got to go to Boston here a few years ago and went to Old North Church, where they had the lanterns up there, in the American Revolution. Yeah. And so we were sitting there. It's still an active church today. And so I was sitting there, and they had a pulpit, and it had on the pulpit, Charles Wesley once preached from this pulpit. And that's the kind of stuff, I just eat that kind of stuff up, thinking that. But, okay, so we talked about how there was this decline in Christianity in Europe. There was also a decline in Christianity in America, religious enthusiasm, partly because of the Enlightenment, partly because of the material wealth of the colonies. People think they don't need God, and when they start getting wealthier. Wealth back then is relatively speaking, but the life expectancy in America was 10 years more than what it was in Europe. So you can see they were living well, okay? And then the Salem witchcraft trials, which you may have heard of, that didn't do a whole lot for the image of American Christianity during colonial times because it was very apparent that there were a lot of people that had been executed that weren't witches, when it was, and the church leaders had failed to stop it, okay, this hysteria. And so you have about a generation now where there's this decline in religious enthusiasm, church attendance is down, and then you have what is called the First Great Awakening. And so let's look, there's two men that are important in this. One is the guy there were other people involved, but these were the two most important ones. Jonathan Edwards was up in New England, and he began to preach something different than most preachers of that day preached. Most people, you had your established church or whatever, you're a member of the church, so therefore you're a Christian. Sort of like if you're in a garage, you must be a car, type of thing. Well, Jonathan Edwards, and I think he actually said something similar to that, like just because you're in a barn doesn't make you a cow, or something. He said something like that. And he said that you have to be born again. Remember, this is the big deal, is the new birth. And so George Whitefield, he meets Jonathan Edwards, and he kind of spreads the Great Awakening. Now let's go back and talk a little bit about him. It is estimated that George Whitefield in his life preached 18,000 sermons to 10 million people. He was... When he was a boy, his parents were Christians, but he didn't want anything to do with it. George Whitefield wanted to be an actor on the English stage. That was kind of like the ultimate thing that you could be in that day. Okay, that was the big deal. And so he studied dramatics. But just sort of like actors today, until they get the big role, they got to do something to put food on the table. And so he was a bartender, okay? And so he's doing that. And he had a friend who was an atheist, and so George Whitefield, he became I'm an atheist too, And they didn't see the guy for a while, and then one time George Whitefield was traveling, and in those inns that they had back in those days, the walls were pretty thin and all that. You could hear what was going on in the next room and so forth. And he couldn't go to sleep because some guy in the next room was just moaning and groaning and yelling all night long, and so forth. The guy was yelling, "I don't want to go to hell." And that'd kind of be hard to go to sleep, wouldn't it? If there's a guy in the next room going, "I don't want, oh God, don't, I don't want to go to hell, I don't want to go to hell." And this goes on, and then finally it stops, and goes, "God, the guy went to sleep." Well, he died, is what happened. And the next morning, he realized it was his friend that he hadn't seen for a while, okay? And that really troubled him. And Whitefield had a conversion. And he, instead of becoming an actor on the English stage, he wanted to preach. So he goes to Oxford. He doesn't have any money, he's a poor kid, okay. But and I guess the closest thing that they had to scholarships at that time is you'd be people's servants to the rich kids. You'd do stuff they didn't want to do and all that kind of stuff. And so he while he's there. He wants, he's a Christian, and he wants to meet. There's not a whole lot of Christian kids at the college. I know it's different than that now. It's just full of, Christian kids and everything. But so he finds out, he meets up with a guy named Charles Wesley, and they become good friends, and they start this small group that turns into what we call the Holy Club. Okay, and then John Wesley joins later on, and so these three are kind of like inseparable. They're buddies, and so forth. And so in 1738, if you remember, Georgia was the big mission field. Remember, Wesley had gone over, and he'd come back, and so Whitefield decided he'd go over to Georgia. And Whitefield felt called to start an orphanage, and he started several orphanages. In fact, I think there's still one of them still in existence today that was started by George Whitefield. He comes back to England, and he has a hard time getting a place to preach, but he just wants to preach. He wants to get up and talk, about the new birth, and all the doors closed. So he just goes out in the open air and starts preaching. He goes to Bristol, And people, now here's the thing about George Whitefield, is he was entertainment. Because you got to remember back at that time, they didn't have TV, they didn't have video games, they didn't have movies. He would put on a show. Remember what he was trained to do? On the English stage. So you can see how he was being prepared for all of this. And he would get up there and put on like a play, and he's the one actor in the play. He'd play the devil, and then he'd play God, you know, and all this kind of stuff. And he had a powerful voice, and he preached to the miners. You know, it was a hard group of people, you know. And he began to have these conversions. And then Wesley took over, he was doing the same thing. Whitefield now feels a call to go back to America. And he does. And he even builds an orphanage for slave children. And some of the slave children, they didn't have any, something happened to them, got separated from their parents, and there's these little kids that nobody really has them, and so he sets up an orphanage for them with his own money. By this time, he is beginning to get contributions, and all that kind of stuff, and he would use that money for those kinds of things. Now, at his meetings, even though he was Calvinistic, he was not hyper-Calvinistic. He freely offered the gospel at his meetings. And slaves, this was something unusual for the day, slaves would come to his meetings in the evening and listen to him. And this is really the beginning of African-American Christianity. Really goes back to George Whitefield. He also was ahead of his time. He contracted with a printer in Philadelphia. You may have heard his name before, Benjamin Franklin, and they became good friends, and to publish some handbills. And he'd have people go ahead of him to the town where he's going to go preach and build up the excitement for the meeting. And he advocated. He was a supporter of slavery for economic reasons. He felt like Georgia could not survive without slavery. But he also printed an open letter that was circulated to planters in South Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland, condemning them for cruelty to their slaves. He said they would have to answer to God. He said, you treat your dogs better than you treat your slaves, and that sort of thing. And this became so well known, there was a slave woman by the name of Phyllis Wheatley who wrote poetry, and she wrote a poem in his honor. Okay, now back to Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was not a devout Christian. He was a very worldly guy and so forth. But he was good friends with George Whitefield, and he had heard these stories about Whitefield. So when he comes to Philadelphia, he decides he's going to go hear him preach. And he didn't believe, Franklin was more influenced by this deistic stuff, got to see it to believe it, and people would say things like, Whitefield, you can hear him preach, a mile away, Well, that was a little bit of hyperbole, but he just didn't believe that could be done. They said he preached to people up to 30,000 people at a time. He said, you can't preach to 30,000 people at a time. So when Whitefield comes to Philadelphia, Franklin goes to the meeting, and he starts walking. He goes around, he kind of counts the people in an area, and then he counts the areas, to see how many people are there, and there's about 30,000 people. And so then they said, he could, long ways off. So he starts walking back to his office. He starts pacing it off. He said he was over 500 feet away before he no longer could distinctly, not only could he hear him, But he could understand what he was saying over 500 feet away. Now, that's almost 2 football fields. That's powerful lungs, that he had. And
Quarter of a mile.
yeah, it's a long old ways. And so he continued this. Now, one of the things that happened because of Whitefield is he broke the power of the established churches in America, because no longer, because what was Whitefield preaching? How do you go to heaven? How do you get saved? The new birth. Remember that new birth thing? It didn't matter whether you were a member of the church or not a member of the church. So people showed up for all kinds of different denominations, and so his crowd would be Anglicans and Baptists and Methodists and just what have you. It'd be and people that weren't anything, never been to church. And he starts preaching to all these people, and so they go back to their churches, and and they start preaching the same thing, the new birth, and then it becomes person to person, and it starts growing and growing and growing. An interesting thing happened is many of the people who came to his meeting, they weren't anything. They weren't a member of any church. A large portion of them started joining Baptist churches. And Whitefield heard about this. Now, he's an Anglican, Methodist Anglican, okay? And he just shook his head and he said, all my chickens have become ducks. Now, what he meant by that was, chickens don't like the water. Ducks do. So, they're sprinkling and pouring, and these Baptists, they just dunk them right underneath the water and so forth. And
That would have made a good sermon title.
yeah. Now, there's one thing, he preached his last sermon in 1740, and there was no place for him to get up above the crowd, but there was a barrel there, so he stood up on the barrel, and he preached his last sermon the day before his death, and he was buried in Newburyport, Massachusetts, and John Wesley preached the memorial service in London. Of course, Whitefield's buried in America, and they hear about it, and they preach the sermon. Now, let me go back here. These guys were buddies. John Charles Wesley and George Whitefield. I mean, they were tight, okay, as they would say. But then they had a difference of opinion on theology. And Wesley believed that he did not believe in the doctrine of predestination. In fact, he published a book about it, condemning it. And Whitefield did. And now these discussions were sharp. But what they did is they did not do it publicly. This went on for about 2 or 3 years. And finally, Wesley said, we finally came to agree to disagree on this. However, publicly, it started getting out that the Wesleys and Whitefield have separated on this, and people talked about it, and so forth. And so when Wesley preaches a memorial service in London, before the service, a woman came up to John Wesley, and she said, Mr. Wesley, well, I can't do it exactly how they do it. Do you believe you'll see George Whitefield in heaven? And he says, no, ma'am, I don't. And she said, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that you feel that way. And he says, no, ma'am, you don't understand. I believe when I get to heaven, George Whitefield will be so far up there, close to God, I will not even be able to see him. And so these two guys, they had a strong difference of opinion, but their friendship survived that. And they were, Christian brothers and co-workers and so forth. To kind of give you, now it wasn't all sweetness for George Whitefield, though. when he went back to England, they'd heard what he was saying over there in America, and one woman assaulted him with a pair of scissors. Somebody else threw stones at him. They even threw dead cats at him at one meeting. Now, I don't know how they, I guess they killed the cats. So I don't know. And so there's some other things that I won't go into detail what exactly was done, but one old guy got up ahead where he was walking and was in a tree and did something. Okay, pretty bad. Okay, so the reaction to all of this, it split churches all over America. You know, you had the New Lights who agreed with what the Whitfield was doing, and the Wesleys back in England, and the opponents were called the Olites. And so I just think we owe a tremendous debt to these three men, you know, in the way Billy Graham probably is an example of a result of the Great Awakening. You know, that method of open field preaching that they did, you know, comes down to today. Yeah, public evangelism. Okay, history of American Baptists. South Carolina is the origin of Southern Baptist history, and it probably because the king granted a charter to South Carolina of religious liberty, and so this was a place Baptists could go in the South. And the First Baptist Church of Charleston was established in 1682, and in those early years, Baptists tended to be the poorer people in society. Now today you look around, these rich people, and all that go to church here, and and all that sort of thing. But I'm talking about at that time, the planters were usually Anglicans, okay, and Congregationalists, and that sort of thing. But Baptists tended to be poor, and they didn't own slaves for the most part in the early years, and they welcomed blacks, slave or free. And the Quakers were the first to try to work with the slaves, but Baptists were in there early as well. And that's probably one of the big reasons that many blacks are Baptists today. It's a family deal that passed on. Baptist characteristics, independence of each congregation. They tended to join in associations for missionary work and that sort of thing. They were for religious liberty. In fact, it was Baptists who were responsible for Thomas Jefferson's famous letter on the separation of church and state. And if you remember what happened here is the Baptists had been persecuted by the Congregationalists in Connecticut. And so the Danbury Baptist Association heard a rumor that Congress was going to make the Congregational Church the established church of the United States. So they wrote Jefferson a letter. And Jefferson read it himself. It's not like today. I mean, you couldn't write President of the United States a letter. He's probably not going to read it. Okay, he might tweet back or something. But so Jefferson gets this letter, and so he writes them, and he says, "You have nothing." I'm paraphrasing. "You have nothing to worry about, because the First Amendment erected a wall of separation between church and state and this will keep the government out of the affairs of your congregation. You can do whatever you want to do." So that's where that phrase came from. And after he mailed it, he went to church at the Capitol building down the street, which was kind of ironic, in the whole thing. The early Baptists, because if you remember, there were General Baptists and Particular Baptists. Remember that? And there was kind of like people would go from one kind of congregation to another, and even within one congregation you'd have some people that were more Calvinistic, and some people were more Arminian, and some people were in between. That early Baptists really didn't have a hardcore position on that issue, okay? That wasn't the thing. But so as you go along, Baptists begin to grow, and by 1814, they formed the General Missionary Convention. It was modeled after what the Congregationalists had done with the Dutch Reformed and the Presbyterians, the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions that it was formed in 1810. Okay, that's 1810. 1814, you start the first national organization, if you will, of Baptists. Remember, they were all independent congregations up to that time. And 2 Congregationalist ministers were being sent by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions to India. And their names were Adoniram, I guess is how you say it, Judson, and Luther Rice. Now, if you're going to India on a boat at that time, it's going to take you a long time. And they had plenty of time to talk. And they said, you know, when we get over there, we're probably going to run into William Carey. Now, who in the world was William Carey? He was an English Baptist who had done work in India, and he was so well known that they said, it's like he's one guy in all of India. And it says, we're probably going to be asked about believers' baptism and immersion. So we're going to have to answer that when we get over there, or we won't be able to do much for the Congregationalist viewpoint. And so let's study the issue. So they start studying. By the time they got to India, they were Baptists. They had become convinced that was the correct position. And so now they're in a bad spot. They're in India, had been sent over there by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, and now they're Baptists. So what are they going to do? Well, Luther Rice goes home to America, and he starts going to the Baptist churches and saying, hey, we want to be Baptist missionaries in India. Will you support us? And so the oddity of it is that Judson and Rice become the first two foreign missionaries, Baptists, but they had first been sent out by Congregationalists. And so Rice convinces Baptists to create a foreign mission body called the Triennial Convention, so called because it would meet every 3 years. First met in 1817. It was a coalition of associations. So you have like that Danbury Baptist Association. They'd go together with another Baptist association here, another Baptist association here, and these associations then would send people to this convention. And the purpose of the convention was foreign missions. That's how it got started. So at that time, every Baptist congregation in America, through these associations, that wanted to be part of it was part of it. Okay, they have steady growth. Baptists are continuing to grow, but then there's divisions. And it has been said that if you've got two Baptists, you have 3 opinions, and there's even the story about these 2 Baptists were stranded on this island for 5 years, and then they were rescued. And when they were rescued, the people, when they were getting on the boat, they said, there's 2 little buildings out there. Says, why there's 2 buildings? And says, well, we had a church and we had a split, and everything. So there were divisions, and there were doctrinal divisions. One of the first things that caused a problem was Campbellism. Now, Alexander Campbell came over to America. His father, Thomas Campbell, they were Presbyterians. But they come to America, and this is what we call the Restoration period of American history. And so because there was so much religious liberty, people thought, hey, we can restore New Testament Christianity. Well, I always want to first century Christianity. I always think that's kind of funny. Do you really want to be like all those first century Christians, like the ones at Corinth and so forth? But anyway, we're going to try to go back to the New Testament and be just like them. And so the Campbells, Alexander Campbell and some other guys, said we're going to try to have a church that would be just like what it's supposed to be. So we don't have to worry about restrictions by the government anymore. So we can start with a clean slate. Well, they decided after some study that the Baptists had it closest to being correct. They were the most correct, but the Baptists were pretty close. Well, they misunderstood a lot of things, and they formed a congregation, and they joined a Baptist association. Okay? But it became very quickly apparent that they had differences of opinion. First off, the Campbells taught baptismal regeneration, which means you've got to be baptized to be saved. That's part of your salvation. You believe, and then you're baptized, and you're not saved until you're baptized. And the Baptists, of course, taught you were baptized because you're saved, and so they said, well, you're Campbell's, y'all flipping this, and so they argued about that. They eventually split away from and formed their own little movement. They denied the Holy Spirit was active in conversion except through the Bible. Now, eventually, even though he was it was kind of an ecumenical thing, he wanted to see all Christians unite. As it turns out, he winds up starting, other people start a new denomination, sometimes called the Disciples of Christ. Later, they split into the Disciples of Christ and the Churches of Christ. But let me go back to what this did on Baptists, is that Campbell must have been a dynamic personality. As we today would call him, a charismatic personality. And he decided the way to advance his movement of having everybody go back to New Testament Christianity, he says, where the Bible speaks, we speak. Where the Bible's silent, we're silent. Okay? And he would go into a town and he would challenge a local preacher to a public debate. And he'd just chew them up and spit them out. He'd twist them around, and these Methodists, well, I'll show you, And when he'd have him humiliated in a few minutes. And then so the Presbyterian would try him out, and he'd do the same thing. And Baptists, in places like Tennessee and Kentucky, they would have these debates, and entire Baptist congregations would switch over to the Campbell's movement, become disciples of Christ or Christian church, whatever you want to call them. And it took a heavy toll on Baptist churches in the South. Now, keep that in mind, because we're going to talk about somebody else comes along to challenge the Campbell stuff, but not yet. And then another division was the anti-mission movement. John Taylor of Kentucky, Daniel Parker, they preached hyper-Calvinist views. Remember what hyper-Calvinists, they basically said you don't really preach the gospel to anybody because, if God wants them to be saved, they're going to be saved. And there were a lot of people that, in fact, that opposed Whitefield on that basis. Even though he was a Calvinist, they said, hey, God wants those people to be saved, they'll be saved. They didn't like foreign missions. It says that's presumptuous. God wants those people from India to be saved, He's going to do it. Well, and so this anti-mission movement grew up within the Baptist life, so to speak, and so they took some Baptists out, and they became primitive. You may have heard the term primitive Baptists or hard-shell Baptists. I guess you're just a hard shell, you're not going to be saved, or well, I don't know exactly how that comes from. They oppose Sunday school. And they opposed Sunday school on the basis that, Paul said, let there be no divisions among you. So if you have Sunday schools, that's dividing people up, I don't know. I'm just telling you what he said. Okay, sectional divisions, and then of course you got the tariff and slavery began to split Northerners and Southerners. At the time, black slaves were oftentimes members of Southern white-led churches. They were members, and then sometimes you'd have a black preacher who would actually preach in the, in place of, like, the white preacher be gone, the black preacher would get up and preach, and from stories I read, a lot of them preferred the black preacher, and all that. So when we think of segregated churches, somebody said it, and I can't remember who it was, that the most segregated hour of the week is church. It's Sunday, but is on Sunday. But that was really something that came after the Civil War, not before, because what happened is they'd be segregated within the church building, but they were all together. Anyway, the specific thing that came to a head is the slavery issue was becoming more and more intense and emotional. And Northern Baptists put forth a proposal to not allow slave owners to serve as missionaries or be on mission boards. Well, that's the whole purpose of the Triennial Convention, was mission efforts. And so long story short is they agreed to separate. Okay, and both sides kind of put the best face on it, I guess you'd say, is that, like one guy said, well, Paul and Barnabas separated and they doubled their effort. They said, they shook hands. In 1845, you have the Southern Baptist Convention is formed. Now, the Southern Baptist Convention was more a stronger denominational structure than they had in the North, while maintaining the autonomy of a local church. And then divisions within the Southern Baptist Convention, the Landmarker movement. Remember I said there was somebody going to come along, he's going to challenge, these Church of Christ preachers, He said, and that was a big deal, Campbell trained people to be debaters and so forth. Well, J.R. Graves, he said, I'll take them on. And he did. And so now they kind of feared J.R. Graves because he was really good. He began to win these debates. The problem is, sometimes you oppose something so strongly because, one of the marks of Campbellism was a lot of them believed that they were the only ones going to heaven, that you had to believe. I don't know if Campbell himself originally believed that, but that became kind of a deal. So Graves goes into this landmarker thing. Now what that meant was that you had to be a Baptist, not to be saved, but they were the only true church. And so other churches weren't really churches. They were just societies or associations and that sort of thing. So you couldn't accept their, closed communion became a very important part of landmarkism. They believed you could trace Baptists all the way back to Jerusalem, and all that kind of stuff, and unbroken. He was a Southern Baptist, okay? Now, eventually, J.R. Graves passes on, and people who followed him formed the Missionary Baptist movement, or the American Baptist Association was the largest of these Graves-type people in Texarkana, Arkansas in 1905. You may have heard of the Missionary Baptists. So all these divisions, and then you've got the Sunday School Board is created in 1863 with Basil Manley Jr. and John Broadus headed that up. And that's where you get the Broadman Press. You may have heard of Broadman stuff. That's where that's come from. It's a combination of their name. And this literature really helped unite the Southern Baptist Convention, because what their plan was that all through the Southern Baptist, you had people, they couldn't come up with a Sunday school lesson, you know, these untrained people. And so they would write up the Sunday school literature for them. And so all over the Southern Baptist Convention, they would be studying the same thing every Sunday. Okay? And so that was an important part in driving the growth of the Southern Baptists. One final thing that hurt the membership was that after the Civil War, black Baptists wanted to, let's see how to put this, they formed the National Baptist Association, and most of them were former Southern Baptists, okay? And so they lost, I don't know, 2 or 3 million, you know, members or whatever it was. But they separated because they wanted to be in leadership positions, and that was not going to be possible in the white churches because the white churches had the majority. And so what happened in a lot of cases, a really strange deal, is that after they left, they said, okay, we'll just build ourselves a new building and you can have ours. And so that happened all over the South in several different cases. And they continue to have, I would say, amiable relations and you know, that sort of thing, but they just didn't meet together anymore, okay? And so that leads to the most segregated hour, and not just Baptists, of course, but it was throughout American Christianity.